university aspires that the BML Munjal Memorial Lecture Series would evolve into an institution by itself and become an integral part of the calendar of intellectual and cultural events in the city of Delhi. We hope to hold this lecture every spring, which in Delhi is a brief window of time starting in February. This is also our tribute to the city of Delhi and its tradition of conversations, reflections, and debates. Interestingly, IIC has a whole bed of daffodils and other kinds of springtime flowers, which is on display here. If you have the time, you should go and see. And tulips as well. Yeah, these are imported, of course. This series will bring together some of the most influential among scholars, creative minds, and change makers to deliberate on subjects of contemporary significance, reflecting BMU's commitment to thought leadership and intellectual inquiry. We are fortunate that we have with us Professor Jeffrey Sachs to deliver the inaugural lecture in the series. Professor Sachs is a distinguished scholar of economics and public policy. His presence here today is most opportune since we are in the process of establishing a Center for Public Policy and Governance at BMU. So Professor Sachs' lecture this afternoon is also serving as one of the inaugural events for our Center for Public Policy and Governance. Professor Sachs has also been a critical commentator of the changing global power structures and dynamics. He has for some time been alerting the world about the impending end of the unipolar moment and the birth pangs of a multipolar world. This moment has gone too far, I think. But he has been a great votary of the continuing importance of multilateral institutions of global governance and the critical importance of universal adherence to international law. You'll agree that no moment in time in the recent past has been as challenging as the present one on the matter of rule of law in the international arena. I will request Professor Arindam Banerjee, Dean School of Liberal Studies, to introduce Professor Sachs more appropriately and deeply. But prior to that, I must discharge my pleasant responsibility of introducing our chair this afternoon, Professor Deepak Nayyar. Professor Nayyar is a much respected scholar worldwide in economics and public policy. He is a distinguished professor of economics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and has taught in several institutions of repute, including Oxford University and the New School, New York. He has written several highly influential books. 3 recent books of his are particularly relevant in the discussions here today, marking the 50 years since the publication of Gunnar Myrdal's Asian drama. Professor Nayyar wrote his most insightful book, Resurgent Asia, Diversity in Development. Wider published it, and OUP has brought it out. Along with this, he also edited a book, Asian Transformations, an inquiry into the development of nations. Earlier in 2016, his book, Catch Up, Developing Countries in the World Economy, has made a remarkable impact in the world of scholarship and policy. Professor Nayyar has held important positions in academia as well as government. He was Vice Chancellor, University of Delhi. He was also Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. He is at present the chair of the board of the Institute of Development Studies, Sachs. I request Professor Deepak Nayyar and Professor Jeffrey Sachs to already come to the stage. And I will now request Professor Arindam Banerjee to introduce today's speaker, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Menon, for introducing the BML Munjal Memorial Lecture Series. Professor Jeffrey Sachs really needs no introduction, but nonetheless, I'll do the honors. Jeffrey Sachs is the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, where he holds the rank of university professor, the highest academic rank within Columbia University. He also directed the Earth Institute of Columbia University from 2002 to 2016. He's the president of the UN Sustainable President of the Nations Network, a commissioner of the UN Broadband Commission for Development, and an SDG advocate for UN's Antonio Guterres. Between 2001 and 2018, Professor Sachs has served as special advisor to as many as 3 UN Secretary Generals. The New York Times called Professor Sachs probably the most important economist in the world, while the Economist ranked him as amongst the 3 most influential living economists. He is widely recognized for his bold and effective strategy policy prescriptions to address complex economic challenges and humanitarian challenges, including the debt crisis, hyperinflations, the transition from central planning to market economies, control of AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, and the escape from extreme poverty and the battle against human-induced climate change. Apart from being one of the leading economists of our times, Professor Sachs is also a best-selling author. He has authored and edited numerous books. 3 of his books, The End of Poverty in 2005, Commonwealth Economics for a Crowded Planet in 2008, and The Price of Civilization in 2011, featured as New York Times bestsellers. He is a leading advocate for sustainability and was the co-recipient of the 2015 Blue Planet Prize, the leading global prize for environmental leadership, and 2022 Tang Prize in Sustainable Development. He was twice named amongst Times Magazine's 100 most influential world leaders, has received 32 honorary doctorate degrees and several highest state honors across the globe. He is undoubtedly one of the forceful voices for peace today in our planet. We are deeply honored and grateful to have Professor Jeffrey Sachs among us to deliver the inaugural BML Munjal Memorial Lecture. I would now like to hand over the proceedings to the chair, Professor Deepak Nayyar, for taking this forward. Thank you.
I've always believed that the best chair is a silent chair. Following that rule, I'm going to invite Professor Jeffrey Sachs to deliver his lecture. Thereafter, I might take a few minutes to say something.
Thank you. I will count on that.
Thank you so much to BMU and to inviting me to give this inaugural address, and thank you for the honor, Professor Nayyar, of chairing this event, and for the distinguished group here. I'm most grateful to have the chance to be together with you. It was 46 years ago that my wife and I first came to India and fell in love with this country, and we come back. Why don't you? And we come back as often as we can. And it was 31 years ago that we stood in the lobby here of the ICC and met my dear colleague, Dr. Nirupam Bajpai, with whom I've been working closely on Indian issues for the last 31 years, and for the next 31 years, we're counting on it. So it's really wonderful to be in this venue as well. And it was nice to hear also in the introduction the reference to Gunnar Myrdal's Asian drama and Professor Nayyar's commentaries on it. Because in 1979, as grad students backpacking around India with an all India Air pass, so any place you could get a seat, you could get a flight. And we spent many, many weeks crisscrossing the country. I had Asian drama in my backpack, a big, thick book. Like so many fascinating, big, thick books, it was all wrong, but it was fascinating. It was, in my view, of course, it was a backward-looking account, very pessimistic about Asia. It was a pessimistic account, broadly speaking, at the moment that Asia was in the beginnings of a fundamental transformation that would bring us to where we are today and to my talk. It's very hard in our field not to be backward looking, by the way. The goal is to understand and not only anticipate, but to help shape. But the overwhelming tendency is to predict from the past in a kind of naive extrapolation. It was once thought India had its Hindu growth rate. It was topped at maybe 2% per capita growth, and that this was the beginning and the end of it. And many explanations were given for that, and similarly, explanations were given in the past for why China would not develop, or why Japan would not develop, or why almost any other region of the world other than the author's particular region would not develop. Max Weber could not imagine outside of the Protestant world the kind of economic dynamism that has come. And I think if there's one overarching truth that has been the case for the last 75 years, it is that we are, broadly speaking, with all of the noise and uncertainties and exceptions, in a world of convergence in economy and in technology. And this is the most fundamental aspect of the world for the last 75 years. It follows a period of roughly 200 years of economic divergence. The economic divergence was a period in which first the Western European countries, which became European imperial powers, began a process of what was at that point unprecedented, sustained economic development and industrialization, starting around the middle of the 18th century, around 1750. And by the middle of the 19th century, had turned that into pretty much full-fledged geopolitical dominance of the world, especially with Britain, and you were the crown jewel of the British Empire, of course, and that European dominance was not only a political dominance and an economic dominance, but it was an enforcement of divergence, meaning that the Western world, so-called, which is really geographically the North Atlantic countries on both sides, US and Britain and continental Western Europe, continued to have economic expansion, whereas much of the rest of the world, including this country and China and many other places, and all of Africa, which was colonized from the 1880s onward primarily, did not have economic development. And so not only was there a profound gap of economy, technology, and power, there was a widening gap. And that process, which we summarize as economic divergence, lasted pretty much until the middle of the 20th century. It ended in two European civil wars, the World War I and World War II, and the chaos economically in between with the Great Depression. By the end of that period, India had its independence. China had de facto its independence because Japan had been defeated, and China was now a sovereign country, really, for the first time in the previous century. And most of Asia and Africa would gain independence sometime from the late 1940s to the late 1970s. It's my basic observation that it was the end of the political dominance of Europe that opened a world of convergence. When Europe dominated, even the most basic investments that a society needs to make for development, and the most basic is education, and the second most basic is physical infrastructure. both of these were essentially blocked by the imperial powers. Mass education was the opposite of what the imperial powers wanted to maintain their control. There was, of course, some elite education. There was a smidgen of education for a larger group, but education was the very bottom of the list of imperial targets. And when it came to infrastructure, which the British built a lot here, it was infrastructure for specific agricultural or mining or industrial processes, not for economy-wide development. And it was the end of that imperial era that opened up the path to economic convergence. In my view, we've been in that era of economic convergence since the 1950s, although it's very uneven across countries. The first countries to really experience economic takeoff after World War II were in East Asia and to an important extent under a US security tutelage. Then came China, which modeled its development after 1978 on Japan and on the Japan-like successes of Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, the Asian tigers, so-called, and China began that process very much in that model, starting in 1980 with Deng Xiaoping's reforms. And India began, of course, many fundamental processes of convergence already with independence in the 1950s and 60s, but the bigger takeoff started in the 1990s because of the long delay of basic economic reform measures. Broadly speaking, and I'll just say this very quickly and parenthetically, what have we learned about convergent or catching up growth? It is that it is a mixed set of institutions. Anyone who says it's a market activity alone is silly and naive and has read far too many economics textbooks. Anyone who says it's state-led alone clearly hasn't read books in the last 40 years because they misinterpret. Economic catching up turned out to be, not surprisingly, a mix of public and private institutions, a mix of basic market forces and individual entrepreneurship, which also played a role, a balance of institutions which ensured broad-based education, but at the same time the ability of some people to get very rich and to develop large, powerful enterprises that could transform their economic sectors. So there was no simple blueprint, no extreme argument. It's become fascinating to me over my career how the most interesting books, which are wrong, as I said, almost all interesting books are wrong in a fundamental way. They're typically interesting because they stake out an extreme position, and then they follow the extreme position to its logical conclusion. It's only the market economy. It's only state leadership. It's only entrepreneurship. You can name it's the only. And then it's a fascinating read and everybody argues over it. But the fact of the matter is that economic development is a very broad-based process institutionally, and it requires a mixed set of institutions. In my later life, I've come to love the philosopher Aristotle, who in the Western tradition, in my view, is the most important philosopher of our history. And his basic point on almost everything was there's a middle argument which is right, and mixed institutions rather than extreme forms are typically the most successful and the most stable over time. So just to say that this age of convergence was made possible by the end of the structures of imperial dominance. Those came about, it's sad to say, it's really, I think, truthful to say, not mainly because of Mahatma Gandhi's campaigns for independence, although he and all his heroic generation made that possible, but because of the suicide of Europe over the course of 30 years, which destroyed Europe and destroyed the bad side also, which was its imperial rule. It obviously did not destroy the hubris, by the way. That is alive and well in Washington, and I'll come to that in a moment. But it did destroy the reality of a world dominated by the West or the North Atlantic region. And again, the process of economic convergence is pretty basic and very powerful. And this, I think, is also worth underscoring. Why did Asia start to grow so fast? In one sense, it's not so hard to find the formula. What was the great breakthrough in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries? It was mass literacy, technology, and the ability to deploy that financially, both through markets and through public investments. That was the key. And where was Asia and Africa and almost all of the again, I'm going to say Western world, but that's always in quotation marks because it's a meaningless word other than North Atlantic or some specific connotation. But where was the world in 1950? Almost all of the literacy was concentrated in a few places, especially in the North Atlantic region. Almost all of the science and technology was concentrated in those places. This was by design to an important extent because of more than 100 years of imperial power that had kept it that way. But once the imperial power broke, the diffusion of basic knowledge, the implementation of mass education, the spread of literacy, the training of senior scientists and technologists started to proceed apace. And that's why economic convergence occurs, because that flow is natural. Knowledge flows. Every child in any place in the world can become educated, can become literate. I would say every community can produce scientists and technologists no matter where they are in the world if there's a public investment and a public school and so forth. And that was blocked until 1950, and the imbalance of knowledge, literacy, education, science, R&D, and so forth was so vast in 1950 that it meant that there was actually a flood of technological capacity and a rebalancing of literacy and schooling that occurred after that. And that's the fundamental driver of the 75 years of convergence since then. And at every stage of my career, which started in 1980, I bet on the convergence. And at every stage, that bet has been right. One of my typically well-timed books was in 1997. I produced a book for the Asian Development Bank called Asia Rising, just a week before the Asia financial crisis. As usual, this was a book never heard of again It was very embarrassing, I think, for the Asia Development Bank, except that the forecast is almost exactly on the mark. It was just a simple extrapolation of catching up growth to say that 25 years from the dating of 1997, Asia would be the center of the world economy, China would be very successful, India would be growing rapidly and so forth, and that's what happened. Not in the downturn of 1997, 1998, but in the longer term. That's also why I stopped being a short-term macroeconomist, which is what I was trained. I was trained to look at business cycles and so forth. It's too hard. If you ask me what's going to happen in 6 months, I haven't a clue. If you ask me what's going to happen in 60 years, I'm going to give you a precise account, which is also going to be accurate, not just a dodge, but it's going to be more accurate than what I could tell you about 6 months from now. So each stage, I bet on continuing catching up, because I believe that every part of the world has the natural potential for catching up, for knowledge, for participating in the worldwide scientific and technological advance, and that every cultural argument about that I have found wrong, although cultures of politics are actually more accurate. Politics has a certain deep cultural aspect to it that persists across even revolutions and regimes, but economics not so much. Because economics, if you give opportunities, open markets, make connections, and make basic investments, the catching up will continue. So let me start at that point, looking forward now. In 1992, the United States, Canada, and Western Europe was still about half the world population, half the world GDP, excuse me, half the world output measured at purchasing power parity terms. So it's about 48% of world output, North America and Europe. Today, it's about 35%. Almost the entire share that went from the North Atlantic at that point has come to Asia. The bulk of that is the rise of the share of East Asia in economic development, because China has had the best run of any large economy in world history from 1980 until today. And then more recently, India's rapid growth, which is now faster than China's and will remain faster than China's for years to come. If we look forward from today, where the Western countries of North America and Western Europe are perhaps 35% of world output, and look to mid-century, that will decline again significantly to perhaps 25% of world output. And if we look to the end of the century, maybe to 15% of world output. There is no way that the United States remains the dominant country in the world. Even to mid-century, the US will be third behind India and China. Actually, China and India still probably in 2050. And by 2100, India will be the largest economy in the world, the largest population in the world, and the Western countries, so-called, will rank considerably lower if this process of normal convergence continues. And this is, I think, the most important point. The next rise of share of the world output will be South Asia, actually, India, and other neighboring countries. The more you talk to them, the better, by the way. The more India is actually cooperating, even trading with Pakistan, with Bangladesh, with others, it may seem unimaginable right now, but the more there is a true South Asian community, the better for everybody. This is the most basic point of economic development, in my view, is be nice to your neighbors. Something I'm trying to help Washington understand as well, because we're not being nice at all right now. Or our president would say he's being so nice he wants to make them the 51st and 52nd state, which they're not so enthusiastic about, I have to confess. So the next rise will be India and neighborhood. And the reason is that India's growth right now is about 6% per year. It could be 7% per year with a bit of tweaking and reform. That's a very nice pace for 1.5 billion people because that's a doubling of GDP every 10 years. And that would be a good pace to achieve and is absolutely achievable. If we look ahead the next 30 to 50 to 75 years, the next big shift in the world is not what anyone's talking about, but it's going to happen, and that is Africa, which plays almost no discernible role in the world economy right now, other than as a provider to a modest extent of some mineral commodities, will become a major part of the world economy. And this is the same process of convergence as has occurred in Asia. And I think one of the most important things to understand just about the basic arithmetic of convergence is that no part of the world will dominate because every part of the world will converge step by step in living standards, and no part of the world will dominate in population. And the fear of China becoming the world hegemon following the US is plainly silly, because China's population has peaked and it is now on a very steep descent between now and the end of this century. According to the UN's latest population revision, which is as much a mechanical extrapolation as it is a real forecast, but it's useful as a forecast, China's population will decline to under 700 million people by 2100. This is stunning. Less than half of today's population. India's, on the other hand, because of the very different patterns of fertility rates, will peak at around 1.6 billion and then settle by the end of the century at about 1.5 billion, probably roughly twice the size of China. Don't fear China. The Himalayas, anyway, are tall. It's a big barrier, but also you're going to be twice their size. Don't be mean to them, but don't fear them either. And this, I think, is why all of the idea of the US also, which is in a completely neurotic state about China, not an analytical state, a completely psychologically neurotic state, is because they cannot use numbers in Washington, and they don't look at data, and they don't understand that China's share of the world economy has basically peaked. It will peak at around 20% of world output, and then it will decline. Not because China will fail, but because China's size in population will diminish from around 18% of the world population today to around 7% of the world population by 2100. They're very concerned about it. They're now trying to have a two-child policy, a three-child policy, a more-child policy, but it won't work. It won't work because fertility rates are low and are going to stay low in all high urban centers of the world. Children are expensive, if you don't notice it. They take 25 years to raise at a minimum, whereas your next robot will get a PhD in 3 hours. And so the robot-child trade-off is very powerful, and it's going to be even more powerful in the future. And this means that these demographics are actually quite real. So Africa's share of the world economy, which is negligible today, will become 20, 25, even 30% of the world economy by the end of the 21st century. This is also, I think, helpful to think about national strategy, because if you are thinking really about national strategy, think about the future markets, not the past markets. The US, Europe, little boring, protectionist, little bit slow, but the big growth in the world is going to come in Africa. That's for sure, quantitatively. Big growth is going to come throughout Asia. It's not going to come in the old, mature, slow-growing, demographically declining parts of the world. And so that means that economic strategy, markets, export development, and so forth should really be geared towards the future. So, what could go wrong? I want to ask. Unfortunately, everything. The underlying reasons for optimism, in my view, are very strong, because we're in a technological, miraculous age. It's nothing short of that. The advances that can come from AI are truly breathtaking. They're not hype. We have no reason to have earned so much power from these technologies. No one could have imagined even 10 years ago that the Nobel Prize in chemistry would be won by somebody who probably didn't have one day of class in chemistry, but is very good at programming computers. And that is Demis Hassabis of DeepMind, who designed an AI system for protein folding, not as a biochemist who spent his life on that, but as a neural network programmer who realized that the computer software could be trained to explain protein folding. And that kind of advance is pervasive across every scientific field right now, across every service sector, across healthcare delivery, across educational delivery, across basic research in material science, in agronomical science, in drug development. We have no right to have expected so much capacity from these neural network systems. And in fact, 30 years ago, they were more or less dismissed as an interesting sideshow, but MIT essentially declared them dead, that this was not the way that expert systems on computers could work. But then came computing power and the data of the internet, which provided a way to train these systems, and suddenly we have an unaccountable, unexpected explosion of capacity across almost every scientific discipline and natural languages. And combining the natural languages with the robotics, we really are going to have, I think Musk is right, we're going to have many more humanoid robots than we have human beings on the planet, probably within the next 25 years. And so this is potentially completely fundamental in breakthrough. I don't think Gunnar Myrdal would have anticipated, and frankly, when Sonia and I were waiting in line at a bank here for about 4 hours with forms filled out, not in triplicate, but in I don't know how many iplicates, to make a tiny transaction about 40 years ago, that you would imagine that every vendor in this country now has a QR code, is online, and so on. And that's just the tip of what can be accomplished in our technological age. So, convergence, completely possible. For the regions far behind, still completely possible. No one is going to be left out of this, in my view. So what are the downsides, or what are the dangers? Well, it is, unfortunately, the human intelligence, or lack of it, not the artificial intelligence, which is the biggest challenge. And I just want to mention a few of the most basic points of our world today. First, the United States and Europe are not in decline, but they are in relative decline. So the US is not in outright collapse, although it's got many crises, by the way, but it's still a very dynamic, interesting country by all standards, and it is the main creator of the digital age, in fact, which is a set of investments that goes back about 90 years now. And I would say the US has done a good job in that. But the relative decline is unavoidable. And that raises, as I said, a neurotic reaction. And we're experiencing that neurotic reaction in two ways. Actually, the first way, starting in 1992 with the demise of the Soviet Union, the United States truly believed it was the permanent, unrivaled power of the world. It told itself that every day. I heard that every day as a Harvard faculty member. Look into a mirror and say you are the unrivaled power of the world. This was essentially a command of the faculty. And it was imparted to our students and throughout the society. Of course, it was a complete illusion and a basic misunderstanding about convergence and temporary advantage, and even what the end of the Cold War had really meant, because it was not a defeat of the Soviet Union so much as a reform of the system of Russia. But the United States likes victories. It doesn't like cooperation. It doesn't like it doesn't like anything more complex than win and lose. And so it was taken as the unipolar moment. Around 15 years ago, China threw a spanner into this. And the spanner was that suddenly that all that 10% per year compound growth that China had achieved since 1980 added up to an economy that was, in purchasing power terms, reaching the size of the US, albeit at 1/4 of the per capita income level. And then China announced in 2014 two initiatives. One, the Belt and Road Initiative, to say we will reach out and make connections with other countries of the world. And the second, a Made in China 2025 initiative, to say we've identified 10 cutting-edge lead technologies and we intend to be a world leader in these technologies. This put the US into a complete frenzy. The audacity of China to launch these things was unforgivable and remains unforgiven to this day. And the US has been going out of its way, including enlisting India, in the effort to contain China. This is not a smart idea. It's not a good idea. It's not a possible idea. It's not an effective idea. It can only lead to either complete failure or to complete trouble. And we're not sure which of the two or both this will be. The failure is on full display every day. The US has not choked China off from technological advance in the slightest, in my view. Whether it's AI or semiconductors or advanced chips or quantum computing or space technology, there's no discernible gap. There is no choke point for the US to maintain dominance. DeepSeek was not the only example of this, but only the latest example. Oh yeah? You think you're 10 years ahead? Oh yeah? And if you go to Shenzhen, as my wife and I do around 3 times a year, you see the cutting edge there, no question. And nothing is cutting off these companies, whether the US puts on export bans or not. So my advice is don't play the game even. The Quad and all of that, this is US think. This is 20th century, old-fashioned confrontation think. This is not serious, make the world a better place, a safer place, and a more prosperous place way to act. China also came to become the low-cost producer of the whole range of green technologies, from renewable energy, long-distance power generation, battery supply chains, and electric vehicles. And again, one other point I would say about this, the US and Europe debated for the last 15 years, well, electric vehicles, are they real, or are they not real? China figured out 15 years ago, electric vehicles are the future. They unleashed an incredible competition of literally hundreds of new companies, and now they're the low-cost producers. And Tesla is just another one of the mix, and not especially competitive in the mix of Chinese electric vehicles. The same, by the way, is about to happen with humanoid robots, where Elon Musk is going to bring out an Optimus robot as part of Tesla next year. China's already got 20 that are comparable, fully on display. So this is why there is no chokehold and no stopping this. Now, India should do the same. These are key technologies. Made in India 2035 makes perfect sense. You need an industrial strategy, because an industrial strategy combines champions, it combines entrepreneurs, like the benefactor of the university, and India has many outstanding entrepreneurs, but they also need government finance for R&D, they need university support, they need early demonstration and regulatory support. They need a financial market that works well and puts in venture capital into these opportunities as well. So this, I think, is the next wave. It also, you have to stop me at any moment, by the way, because I have about 8 hours of things I'd like to say. It will kill you with your patience, but I'll try to limit my time just for another 10 minutes. What other threats do we have that can get things completely off track from what otherwise can be truly a golden era, I would say, an era of global convergence and rising living standards? Obviously, what I haven't mentioned at all yet, but is fundamental, is the ecological crisis. The ecological crisis is real. It's multifaceted. It comes from the obvious fact of 200 years of industrial development with very little attention to the ecological consequences. And it's inconvenient. because it would be nice if coal, oil, and gas would continue to be the fundamental primary energy sources for the world, because we know them, we know where they are produced, we have generations of engineers who understand them, and so forth. But it's not to be, because global warming has accelerated. This country is one of the most vulnerable in the whole world, in some ways the most vulnerable. There are no other places in the planet with such large populations experiencing 50°C events as India. Other countries will experience other kinds of disasters with rising sea levels and so forth, but India will experience heat waves that are unimaginable, but for very concentrated populations at enormous scale, an enormous challenge to water security. And so this is not a small matter, and this is why the transformation of the economy to a zero-carbon economy is really paramount. India has a goal to do this by 2070. It should be done by 2050, I'm sorry to tell you. It could be done by 2050. It would be a lot of investment. A lot of nuclear power, by the way, will have to be part of this, as well as renewable energy, but India has the potential for both and should develop both. But the stakes are extremely high. Yesterday, I hosted a talk by my climate guru colleague, James Hansen, who was America's lead climate scientist for the last 30 years. He's just come out yesterday with a paper about the acceleration of global warming, which is now proceeding at faster than 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade. And he explains the recent rise of world temperatures, which have risen by 0.3 degrees C in the last 5 years, as you've noticed. We breached the 1.5 degree, and he explains it by the fact that there was a lot of clearing up of air pollution, of sulfur aerosols in shipping, and that was causing dimming of the sunshine up until 5 years ago. That has been cleared, and the underlying warming is now becoming evident. And he had told me already 10 years ago that this was going to happen, and now it's happened, and he's documented it extremely carefully. So when India takes on the technological revolution and takes on the Made in India 2035 program, which is needed, it should take on the commitment to the green transformation as well as the digital transformation. It's not a gimmick, it's not simply a cost, it is the inevitable future for the whole planet. Trump, of course, doesn't understand it at all. And a little bit like a child, he loves money now. And he loves what he calls liquid gold, which is oil and gas under the ground. It's a little primitive. I don't think he ever studied global warming one day in his life. It's quite convenient if you're funded by the oil industry to say that it's a hoax. It's not a hoax. America will not stop its transformation to zero carbon energy. By the way, Trump won't even slow it down. In fact, I doubt that he'll get more drilling going because nobody sees a future in any of that. And when half your city of Los Angeles burns down a couple of weeks ago, you kind of get the message that something serious is underway. So for India, don't ride a coattail of Trump saying, well, we're out of the Paris Agreement. Take it as an opportunity to lead the way together with China on the technologies of the future, because this is really where the future markets are as well as where the future needs of the world are. The final point I want to say is that our biggest single risk in the world is geopolitical and military. And that is, unfortunately, in my view, I'm only speaking for myself, but it is the United States being the most dangerous country in the world in the next period of time. And that is because the US believes in its hegemony still, or its unilateralism. Trump is not exactly a hegemonist the way that the Biden group was, because Biden was an old-fashioned American dominance president, living somewhere around the 1990s in his mind, thinking that we are now the only superpower in the world. Trump is more clever than that. But Trump's view is we don't have to cooperate with anybody. We don't really have any friends. We don't really have even any interests other than his own. And we don't need to be in treaties. We don't need to be in the UN. We don't need to even abide by the golden rule, if I could put it that way, because Trump's basic message is don't bother us in our neighborhood and we will bother you in yours. This is the main message of American foreign policy. Don't come anywhere close to the United States, and that includes Greenland, Canada, Panama, wherever we draw the line, but we reserve the right to be in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, in Taiwan, in any context that we want, that if you were doing it to us, we would view that as a cause of war. This is the American mindset, unfortunately. The next stage of moral development, as Lawrence Kohlberg called it, which usually comes at around 4 years old, is you should do the other what you would like them to do to you. And we're not quite there geopolitically yet. So this is, to my mind, our biggest risk. We are, as the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists unveiled on January 28th, in its doomsday clock, 89 seconds to Armageddon. What they mean by that, as they explain by the clock, is that our threats of nuclear war, environmental catastrophe, runaway autonomous weapons, and other extraordinarily dangerous technologies have brought us closer to the risks of survival itself than at any time in modern history. This doomsday clock was started in 1947 after the atomic bomb was first invented and then used. And at that point, the clock was put at 7 minutes to midnight. When the Soviet Union ended in 1991, the bulletin put the hand of the clock at 17 minutes from midnight, saying we are safer now than we've been at any time during the Cold War period. We've had since then Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, 5 presidencies, every one of which inherited a clock that was farther from midnight than they left it to the next administration. Biden left the clock at 89 seconds to midnight. And I think it's a slightly over-optimistic assessment. We are firing missiles into Russia as we speak. Biden and now apparently Trump have given the green light to Ukrainians to use ATACMS missiles, which are medium-range, non-nuclear missiles, to fire deep into Russia. And the point that President Putin has been making for years is that those missile systems require US programmers actively setting the targets, tracking the missiles, managing the launches. So this is an attack by the United States on Russia, nothing less. Is that a good idea when Russia has 1,600 nuclear weapons and the United States has 1,600 nuclear weapons actively deployed on both sides? I don't think so. So I want to end by also appealing to India to play its role in global peace. I have one particular pet project that I want to help promote. India needs to be the 6th permanent member of the UN Security Council. The largest country in the world, a superpower by every standard, a country with a tradition of peace, with a philosophy of peace that has given the world a philosophy of peace. We need you in the Security Council. My advice, be nice to China, and they'll help you get in the Security Council. And I want to be there to help as well. Thank you very much.
I think it was 2 decades ago at India International Center that I chaired an event at which Jeffrey spoke, and we disagreed. Much to my surprise, I find we have A, some things in common, B, some things on which we agree, and C, there are still some, if not many things, on which we do not agree. So I will be brief. What we have in common, we both started life working in macroeconomics. Both of us have drifted away. I work much more at the intersection of economics, history, and politics, as you do. Second, both of us have the same history of Gunnar Myrdal. You were backpacking in India. I was a young graduate student in Oxford when Asian Drama was published. I read all 2,600 pages, fascinated, overawed, but distressed by the pessimism that ran through every one of those 2,600 pages. And 50 years later, I decided that it was time to explain to the world why Myrdal turned out to be so wrong. Not simply about the future, but also about the past, because for Myrdal, life began in the interwar years. There was no colonialism. That China and India accounted for 50% of world income and 50% of world population in 1820 was something he did not recognize, or that the underdevelopment of Asia was a consequence, in part, of that imperialism and colonialism. And I think this was driven in large part by the Eurocentric view of the world. And this has been the focus of my work, to see the world economy from the perspective of the South, whether it was catch-up or resurgent Asia. Now, where we agree, I think, is also important. First, I argued, I think this was said in catch-up more than a decade ago, that Europe is in relative decline. But I believe some parts of Europe, particularly Britain, but possibly also Germany and France, are in absolute decline. Second, what we have where I agree with you is that the biggest danger to the future of the world between now and 2050 is twofold. First, the environmental degradation, the climate change that stares us in the face. And second, to me, the world in the mid-2020s looks much like the world in the late 1920s and early 1930s, where resurgent nationalisms, militarisms, chauvinisms, racisms all come to the fore and present the biggest danger to how the world might unfold. I also, I think we have this in common too, and we agree that neither of us, both of us paint want to sketch the big picture on a wide canvas that spans continents in space and centuries in time, rather than join the little dots, which economists have done for quite some time. But there are three areas on which I think we still disagree. First, I do not believe that the United States is in decline. I don't think that it is appropriate to use purchasing power parity to make comparisons of macroeconomic aggregates across countries. In terms of at market exchange rates in current prices, the share of the United States in world GDP has remained in the range of 25 to 30% between 1945 and 2025. No change. In the meantime, we witnessed the share of Japan declining from 18 to 4% in just 20 years. We have witnessed a dramatic decline of countries in Western Europe, particularly the United Kingdom, Germany, and France. I think we need to recognize that the economic dominance, if not the military power of the United States, is something that is real. It's not illusory. Yeah? Second, I think that in 2050, I am not convinced that we will be a high-income country, as Prime Minister Modi hopes. In 2047, there are many things that could go wrong, and maybe we'll come to it in questions. But the three largest economies, in my view, and I am willing to stick my neck out, as you are, for predictions, that the three largest economies in the world in 2050 will be the United States, China, and India, in that order. And the share of each of these in world GDP will be larger than the next five put together. And I'm not speaking in purchasing power parity, I speak in current prices at market exchange rates. But the United States will remain far and away the most influential economy and the richest country in the world. You know, the US had a paranoia about Japan, remember? In the mid-1990s, when Japan had 18% of world income and it had 60% per capita income that was 60% higher than the US. Today, Japan, 30 years later, has only 4% of world GDP and its per capita income is about 3/5 that of the United States. So in a sense, the belief that, you know, because there's nothing automatic about convergence, and it's not about the arithmetic of compound growth rates. Yeah? I don't believe that China is going to overtake the United States in terms of GDP. It has a declining working population. If fertility rates, it can go at best at 3.5% productivity increase. If its fertility rates declined and the yuan does not appreciate as much as expected, its catch-up with the US will slow down significantly. There was one thing on which we do agree, that the remarkable transformation of Asia, and that's the thesis of my books, is attributable to its ability to use states and markets as complements rather than substitutes. Okay? And where their role changes, the role of the state vis-a-vis market changes as time and circumstances change. The countries in Asia that succeeded, particularly East Asia, were able to change that role of the state vis-a-vis the market. The countries that were laggards, and India has been a laggard in the past 50 years, were countries that were not able to adapt the role of the state and of the market appropriately. But let me stop here, because I thought it was important to highlight what we have in common, where we agree and where we still disagree. So I'd like now to invite questions from the floor, and maybe at the end, we could return very briefly to the question of India in 2047, which is part of your title. So if you could pass me the question. All right. Just put them here. Thank you. Patrick Modi from BMU. If population size dictates power, as you argue implicitly, how would you explain the dominance of smaller nations such as Britain, France, Japan in history? India is not dealing with democratic will of Chinese people, but hegemonic Communist Party of China. Question one. Okay, I'll pass the point to you. Question two. From Harsh Pratap Singh, how big of a role do you think is space exploration going to play in the organization of the world order in the coming years? The space is huge and it is up for grabs. Do you think India should invest more in that sector? Okay. Parag Vaknes, Ambedkar University. How do you see developed countries and developing ones negotiate the relative population constraints in the next few decades? How do you see India faring with meager investments in education and health? And there are only 4 here, so I'll read the 4th, and you have them for reference. I can't read this name, forgive me. Ambedkar University, Delhi. We see the economic growth of India unravel to new heights, 6 to 7%. But at what cost do we reach the 6-7% growth? Do all 1.5 billion people experience this growth equitably? Your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you for the excellent questions. First, let me take the last one because it's also related to the third question about the beneficiaries of economic growth. Simply put, in my view, the most important investment economically as well as socially that a country can make is in its children's health and education, by far. So if you want to achieve economic development, especially in our advanced scientific age, all children need quality schooling, need to be able to do math, science, reading, and so forth. And of course, that also requires a proper healthy upbringing, an end of stunting, proper nutrition, a proper vaccine coverage, and other health service coverage. This is the most important investment quantitatively for economic growth, by the way. Much more important than any physical investment. And that's not speaking moralistically, that's speaking very practically. That's speaking on the evidence base of what are the factors, inputs to economic growth. Schooling is crucial, and quality schooling, the evidence shows, is more important than sitting in a classroom. It's what is being learned in the classroom. And there's now a very large research output around the world about quality education. Now, India's educational system is definitely not up to where it needs to be. This is without question. And even the average years of schooling is still very low in this country compared to what you're aspiring to. This is not an insurmountable obstacle. This isn't even hard, by the way. This is some basic public investment that's needed. And to understand this is not to do good. I promise you, it's not about doing good. It's about economic success. So if you want economic success, take a look at the PISA scores. That's the program on international student achievement. India dropped out of them in 2007 because it came in second from the bottom. It was an embarrassment. It left them. It was going to come back, and then COVID intervened in the interim. Please rejoin PISA wherever you score, and then get near the top of the list in the next 20 years. It's obvious that this can be done. By the way, everyone here knows the most basic fact that of every single ethnic group in the United States, the one that is best educated and highest professional is India, are the Indian Americans. So come on, this is not even hard for you guys. But currently, the average years of schooling is about 7 years. Now that averages across cohorts. But in the United States, it's 14 years. And that's your job. Get the schooling up. And by the way, get schools built, get teachers trained, and get schools online. Because if a school's online, it can have a quality teacher no matter where it is, period. Connected classrooms online. So that also has a nice effect. It empowers everybody. It is the most equalizing investment there is in the world, by far as well. It was my whole point about convergence internationally, which was it was finally the ability of India to invest in its own citizens or China to invest in its own citizens that enabled convergence. So this is true within the country also. But it's also fundamental from an economic strategy point of view. So please do that because it's not hard. And use your online prowess to improve the quality of education because this is really a technological breakthrough for education. Every child can have an AI agent avatar as a tutor, as helping the students, as having someone to chat with for their homework in the evening online. Somebody sent me their niece talking to Albert Einstein for their math homework assignment in 4th grade because they made an avatar of Albert Einstein and he answers all the questions very nicely. And he can do 4th grade math. And so you can have tutors now for free. It's an online system. So this is really, I think, a very, very high priority. And yes, will all 0.5 billion people experience the growth? If they're educated, they will. They'll be able to find their place. If population size dictates power, why did small countries achieve dominance? And you can go back not even to countries, to Venice or Genoa or individual city-states at times. Of course, those city-states, even though in our history we say they dominated a small part of the world. They didn't dominate India, they didn't dominate China, they didn't dominate Asia at the time. But what makes dominance possible is technological superiority, because that translates also into military superiority. What made Britain be the hegemon of the world in the 19th century essentially was the steam engine, plus the social organization, plus the mentality that they wanted to beat up everybody. But it was basically the steam engine that made it possible. But it was not a lasting dominance. And this is why today what's amazing, I said culturally Britain is as imperialistic as ever, by the way. They're telling everyone, go defeat Russia. We're going to defeat Russia. We're going to do all these things. Of course, they have nothing to add other than their cheerleading. But the mentality remains, but the reality isn't there at all, fortunately, in my opinion. But the point is, it was a temporary advantage which diffuses. And if you can prevent the diffusion, then you can postpone the decline. The United States, I'll say, in this regard, is 4.1% of the world population. So the question is, what can you really get out of 4.1% of the world population for the long term? I don't think continued economic dominance. I would say the US dominance came from the following elements. First, of course, continental scale. That's not going away. The United States will not be defeated. It will remain a continental scale. That already puts you in the top 10, let's say, pretty guaranteed. Two big oceans, continental scale. Second is that when the European powers defeated themselves between 1914 and 1945, the United States was the only one that remained standing. So the situation in 1945 was absolutely extraordinary. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. Detroit, when I grew up, when I was born, was a powerhouse of technology because it had built the airplanes and the fighter jets and everything else for World War II, and the tanks and so forth. But this is, again, a faded dominance. That dominance does no longer applies, which is, by the way, why Russia is not defeated militarily in Ukraine. The United States threw a lot of its technology at Russia in the last 3 years, but it did not defeat Russia, not even close. In the end, the numbers of troops turned out to dominate still, even in this very capital-intensive age of warfare that we have. But still, the United States doesn't dominate Russia in military capacity to actually fight a war, for example. And if the U.S. were to get into a war with China in the South China Sea, it would get completely defeated, no doubt. So this, I just think we need, I want to keep perspective on that. The U.S. is a very sophisticated financial market, lots of depth to it, probably asset prices way overvalued at this point because the price-earnings ratios of the New York or the U.S. stock markets are out of sight. But I agree with Professor Nayyar that the U.S. remains a powerful country. I don't think it will be the dominant country in any meaningful sense, not militarily. China will. I should just add one more basic point. Two more basic points. India should invest in its military. I'm a pacifist, but India should invest in a strong domestic military industry so that it's not dependent on the US or China or Russia for its security. That, I think, is point one. Point two is you get a lot of technological advance from those investments that spill over to every place. So the reason why the US, Britain, Russia, China are so technologically sophisticated, but you could add in Israel, Korea, and others, is the heavy military investments. I hate the wars. I think it's incredibly crazy. But I would not put a country of 1.5 billion people at the dependence of someone else's technology. I wouldn't. India's big enough to have its own arms industry and to invest in its own technology for this. The reason I say this is that you watch the behavior of the major powers. If India depends on its military security for the US or on Russia or on China, good luck. Don't. So it's, yeah, Sonia's very unhappy with that. I don't want you to waste a lot of money on it, but I also don't want India, I want India to be a great power independently and not to be dependent on others, because as the biggest population in the world, it makes sense, you can afford it, and you don't have to feed our arms industry. That's the point. They want to sell you lots of weapons. I don't think you need to buy the weapons there. I think you should develop your own technologies and be secure. And it comes to this question of space as well. I will leave Elon Musk to go to Mars if he wants. He should spend his own money to do it, as far as I'm concerned. But space capacity is a part of economic and military security for a country. Because if you are dependent on geolocation by someone else's satellites, they will cut you off the first day of a war. And so you need your own low Earth orbital satellites, you need your own connectivity, you cannot depend on Elon Musk for Starlink, and so forth. And this requires a space industry. And again, my theory is India is big enough to have all industries here. We're not talking about, we were last week in Barbados, it's 260,000 people. They can't have a space industry. But you can have a space industry, and I would do it. Now, don't do it at the expense of your children. Don't say we can't afford, we need space, so we can't afford education. It's nothing like that quantitatively. And also, don't spend 5% of your GDP on the military. I don't know what it is right now, probably around that. Too much, because you are safe, you're not going to be invaded, you're not going to invade anyone else, and so you don't need it. But when you do spend it on your own technology and industry, I would say, more than on buying NATO equipment or being part of some illusory Quad or some anti-China program and so on. If you remain anti-China, you will not become the sixth member of the Security Council. And I really want you to be. And that means being friendly with your borderland. They're not your neighbor exactly, but they are on the other side of the border in the high Himalayas. And I think that it would be good to have a normal relationship with them. Okay, education and health I've talked about. I think I got all of them. Okay, thank you for the questions.
It is not that we have run out of questions. I think we've run out of time. I have 4 in the basket here. There are another 4 or 8 that await. But the hosts want me to bring this to an end in the next 6-7 minutes. So let me just put 2 questions to you, Professor Sachs, because I think the audience here is interested in the idea of India in 2047. Can it become a developed country? Okay. 2 questions. One in arithmetic, one in history. Yes. Yeah? You know, in 2023, at 23 prices and exchange rates, India's GNI per capita was $2,540, right? We are lower middle income country, all right? If we were to become a high income country in 2047, we would need to reach a per capita income level of $14,000, a little above that. Russia is bottom of that high income grade. For that to happen, India's per capita income would have to grow at 7.4, 7.5% per annum for the next 25 years. Is that feasible? Two, and they are questions together. They are a reality check on an aspiration. It's a desirable aspiration. Yes. Is it plausible? Is it feasible? That's my question. Now, if we look at a history of the world economy since 1950, there are only 3 countries, all Asian, that have made the transition from being low-income countries to becoming high-income countries. And those are Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea, in that order, between the late 70s and early 90s. Now, if we look at China, beginning 1949, as a low-income country, it became a sort of lower middle-income country in 2007. Yeah? And it became an upper middle-income country from low income, and then it will become a high-income country at the end of 25 if all goes well.
Yep.
So China, a country with the fastest growth in human history over the past 30 years, would have taken 76 years to get to high-income status. India, beginning life in 1947, okay, took 60 years to move from low income to lower middle income, 2007. And if all goes well, India will get to being an upper middle income country in 2032, but it could also be 36. Depends on whether it grows at 7.5% or at 5% that is grown in the last. So India would take something like 85 or 89 years to get from low income to upper middle income. Yeah? We are aspiring for a high income status in 2047. The question is it feasible? Yeah. We don't have time for a long answer, but do you think my question one is yes or no?
Yeah. It's feasible. And I think there are a few things to say, just a few words about the timing arguments. There was a lot of lost time for India and a lot of lost time for China. So the actual pace is higher than it looks, taking the whole durée from 1947 or from 1949. China didn't really get started in crucial ways until 1978, and then especially 1980. India lost a lot of time with the license Raj for a long time, and it was really only in the early 1990s onward that many powerful forces, in my view, started to accumulate. That's first point. Second point is we are in a very strong technological age right now. So there's lots of leapfrogging that can be done. I'm a big believer in the digital power, in digital technologies for across the board. So I think what can be done now is extraordinary. It's possible to reach the whole country if there was the desire for it within 2 years. Just like every village became electrified, every school could be online, every child could have a device, every curriculum could be upgraded if there's the desire to do it. And you have the engineers to do that as well, and all the capacity internally to do that. So I think that the headroom is enormous for fast growth. Third, there is something to look at, which I would look at together with you, and I don't have a magic answer. But if you look at the per capita income at $2,500 right now at market prices, and you go back to what you don't like, but I do like purchasing power parity. It's roughly 4 times that. And what does that mean? It means that there is likely to be a narrowing of the gap between the dollar income and the PPP income over the next 25 years. And what does that mean? Technically, it means a real appreciation. The price level here is going to rise. The price level of services is going to rise. And what that means is that you don't have to get from 2,500 to 14,000 in volume terms, because a lot of that's going to happen in price terms, actually. So when we look at how fast the real quantity growth has to be, it's less than the number you quoted of the 7.5% compound per capita growth in real terms at constant prices for market prices. Yes, I'm sorry?
At constant 20.
Exactly, at constant market prices. So the point is that I think technically this is not an outlandish proposition to reach that income level, both because of the capacity to do it in terms of identifiable pathways, but also because of what's really implied in the split between quantity increase and price increase. But I have to check that. I don't want to be glib about that point.
But by the way, we are both economists. We are not in the business of astrology.
Yes.
The world is full of uncertainties. I think the aspiration is both desirable and plausible. But whether it is probable, whether it'll happen, is something that remains uncertain. Now, you've already highlighted the importance of industrial policy, industrial strategy, of investing in development of technology, in reaching this goal. But it seems to me, as a citizen of India, that there are 2 things which are critical in reaching this aspiration. First is that we must create equal economic and social opportunities for our people, irrespective of caste, religion, gender. Yeah? We have not done so yet. Second, I think we need to make a provision, a public provision for education and health care for our people. The real difference between the leaders and the laggards in Asia was precisely these 2.
I agree.
And this is where I think if we are able to do that, we could get there. If we don't do it, we won't get there.
I couldn't agree more, and I want to underscore that this is the most important investment. The idea, by the way, of the Sustainable Development Goals, and especially SDG 4, which is quality education for all, is that it is for all. And so gender, ethnicity, race, religion, it's not there. It's for all. And so it's very basic, very important. I want to add one more thing. Again, find a solution with your neighbors. This will be a direct economic benefit that's quite powerful. The fact that India and Pakistan don't trade with each other, don't even have bus service between the two, was last time I checked, although I don't know whether that's literally still the case. This is such a loss of economic opportunity, gains from trade, mutual benefit. I don't want to oversimplify. I just want to say, as an economist, there's a big prize out there to solving that problem. That's not a costless problem. That's not just something, oh, that's fine. We don't like it or we don't care. That's an economic problem. And I'll say another point, again, I'm going to re-emphasize it again, I have to, with apologies. with China. One place we were in India said, bring your investments, just no Chinese companies. Come on. Bring technology, capital, business, jobs. You'll get huge benefits from this. Nothing's going to happen bad, I promise. If something happens bad, call me, okay? Nothing bad is going to happen. So this is another avenue for another 0.5 percentage point of GDP. You add up these few things around, you can really do quite well. You're already at 6% growth. Just collect a few of these and you're at 8% growth. And then we answer Professor Nayyar's question.
It's my turn to agree with you. I think, South Asia must get its act together. And if India and China are able to transform their rivalry into cooperation, the world will be a better place. But thus far, I don't see evidence on either. I'm being a realist. I must stop. I think we have overstayed the threshold of tolerance on the part of our hosts. I understand that you have to be away elsewhere, and they need another 5 minutes from us. So I'm going to bring this to a close. Thank you for being here. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Sachs, and thank you, Professor Nayyar. I would like to call upon stage Dr. Sonia Sachs, and I would also like to request Professor Arindam Banerjee and Professor Shyam Menon to facilitate the felicitation ceremony.
Yes, if you could. Okay.
Yes. Okay, but the second is Oh, we have two follow. It will maybe one last. So just please, please.
We will. I'm excited to read your...
Thank you, Professor Nayyar. Thank you, Dr. Sachs and Sachs. And I would also like to thank IIC for providing us with the venue, and every actor from the BML Munjal University for making this event possible. I thank each and every one of you, and also the audience for making it here on an afternoon. And finally, we have tea outside, so please, I request all of you to join us for tea outside. Thank you very much, and have a great evening.